G'day, welcome back to more Cowbell, please. This week we're going to get into Gary Smith's story. He is a guy who's been promoting Christian music throughout Europe and England, UK for many years. He's got some great stories going back into the 90s and doing all kinds of acts. Well, you'll hear all the things he got up to. The stories about Wales, small towns in Austria. I think you're going to enjoy this episode with him. I mean, this is a guy who really just cared about whether there was evangelistic purpose in what was happening, ministry value. And I respect that. Now, I did promise Matt Armstrong this week. His episode's pretty long, so I am going to push that one back. It's a wonderful episode. It's going to take me a while to get that one done. Make sure you hit the subscribe button, the notification button. Don't miss out on some of our upcoming guests. We've got some really great stories coming down the pipe. All right, let's get into it. This is Gary Smith. Hey, welcome to the Cowbell, mate. So good to have you.
Thanks, Ainsley.
You know, the Smallbones have spoken so highly of you. David's always given me big kudos to what you've done. And he only does that if it's somebody who is in it for the ministry value. So yeah. I feel blessed to be able to speak with you and hear your experiences in your life. And for those who don't know, David Smallbone is the father of Rebecca St. James and for King Country. Gary Smith is somebody who has done a lot of concert promoting through the UK and Europe and to some exotic places that we'll get into in a little while. But Gary, why don't you start out by telling us your journey of how you got from, you know, first of all, you found Christ and then you came to the place where you got involved in concert promoting and how that happened.
I was born in 1962. I was part of the last generation of British kids whose non-believing parents sent their kids to Sunday school. So everybody on my street, 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning was down the local parish halls whilst our parents weren't in church. Goodness knows what they were getting up to whilst they had that free hour with their kids not in the home. You know, I genuinely can't believe a time when I didn't believe all the things I heard in Sunday school. It seemed perfect sense to me. I mean, I don't think it really impacted the way I behaved. It didn't impact my language and it didn't impact my behavior. But what I did do, and I'm really grateful to God for this, is I did join the Boys Brigade, which is a Christian youth organization that me and a bunch of my mates were part of. And we loved it and all that involved, including having guys that just really cared about us. They loved Jesus in a very simple way and did everything they could to tell us about him. But I would have said it was in my late teens, early 20s when I really decided to take my faith seriously, and I began to work out what that would look like. And I felt like I was probably going to be called into some sort of ministry. And eventually in my late 20s, I actually went to work for the Boys Brigade. And I loved it. It was a great honor, but I realized it's a fairly historic, the oldest uniformed Christian organization in the world. I was really wanting to talk to young people about Jesus and help disciple them.
Tell me what the Boys Brigade is. And by the way, I was in the Boys Brigade.
There you go. Because you're Australian, of course you were.
Yeah, we had it in Australia.
Yeah, so the Boys Brigade is like a Christian version of Scouts. So it's a uniformed youth organization. Its express purpose is to advance Christ's kingdom amongst boys. That's what it was when I was a kid anyway. I went to work for them. As part of my kind of journey of faith, I'd done a couple of things. Number one, I'd been to a big festival called Greenbelt, big Christian arts festival with some great musicians on it. But also there was another thing in the UK called Spring Harvest, which was a kind of worship and teaching festival that happened every Easter. And I realized that the worship and teaching at this festival were amazing and the arts were amazing at this place. And my friend and I decided, wouldn't it be great if we could put those two things together and create something essentially for the adults and young people that were involved in the Boys Brigade? And so we did. We came up with this festival called Firm Foundations, just a weekend, 3 or 4 nights in May every year, where hundreds and hundreds of young people and adults would come to experience all that stuff. And of course, that required us then to begin booking the program, thinking about which artists we were going to have and which speakers and which worship bands and all that good stuff. And this would have been, probably early 80s. So, pre-Delirious a little bit, but kind of round about that period as modern worship was beginning to take off. So we started inviting all the kind of great and good of Christian music in the UK to come. We didn't know whether they would, but we soon discovered that if you invited them and you paid them, they would come. And I don't say that with a genuine, without a cynical bone in my body. It was about naivety from me. The naivety spread to the fact that we paid everybody in cash and we paid them before they went on stage. I'd given them money and they put it in their pocket. And I didn't realize until a little while later what a relief that was to so many Christian artists, because so often they didn't get paid or they got paid part of their money. And so we got a reputation amongst the Christian music industry in the UK, which you didn't even know we had, which was to other artists saying, you should go play that festival. They pay what you ask because they don't know how to negotiate, and they pay you in cash and they pay you before you go on stage. And so we had this little festival where we were trying to work out how to do this stuff. It was great training ground, to be honest.
Yeah. So at this point, it's purely ministry. You're just getting people on the stage to do ministry. This isn't a business event where you're trying to see how much money you can make.
There may well be people in the UK that have been able to make good money out of Christian music, but I don't know many of them. I know quite a lot of them that thought they would and ended up losing a lot of money. There was always a day when if you ran a record label or, a publishing company, you could probably do okay. You'd probably have a good life, but nothing like what you could do in America or even in Australia. It had to be ministry first. I guess our first real connection with business was when a new record label set up in the UK and a distributor for the rest of Europe, and they'd managed to get the contract from the people like Sparrow and Star Song, the EMI labels and the Warner labels into Europe, because they'd come along to our little festival because they'd heard about it and they saw it was pretty well run, and we paid people and we seemed to know what we were doing. As I left the Boys Brigade with my friend to set up a ministry, the very first thing that we were asked to do was, will you help us organize a showcase for our new company where we're going to have some of our biggest acts perform? And we said yes. We just wanted to do anything we could to serve. So we organized that interesting event, like 8 bands a night. Newsboys did their first ever UK show there. PFR were on that. Iona, the Worldwide Message Tribe, Martin Joseph, and a bunch of other artists all came and performed, as well as there being an audience that paid to be there, hundreds, not thousands, hundreds of people there. All the great and good from the American music industry, the record label heads were there as well to see the launch of this new label. And it was a pretty good show. We managed to pull it off, genuinely, I would say, by the grace of God. One thing I'd realized, Ainsley, was I used to work in IT and I couldn't operate a computer. My job was finding great people, programmers and analysts, and getting them the right jobs. And I had an understanding of people who could do things and people who couldn't. And so when I was asked to organize this festival, what I did was I went into the room and I met with the people running the sound company and I met with the people running the lights, and I found a guy I thought who would be able to run the stage, and I brought them all together and I said, this is what we need to do today. Do we think we can make it work? And they said yes. And I looked after them. And so they felt like I was covering their back, and they made the show work. And that was something of a gift that I was able to carry on for years, running big events and productions by getting people who are really good to do what they should do and create actually platforms where artists could perform and minister. And so off the back of that, all the labels suddenly in America we didn't even know trusted us and wanted to have breakfast over the next few days. Could I organize a concert for these or a tour for these people? And we just took all the meetings. And then the following year ended up, as a result of that, doing a huge event, biggest event indoor event in Europe the following year, which had DC Talk headline in it, a whole bunch of British bands as well, and other great artists. Probably about 8,000 people rocked up. And off the back of that, suddenly we had the incoming call for anybody who ever wanted to come to Europe.
What was the name of the label, can I ask? Was that?
The label was called Alliance Music.
So that show with DC Talk was kind of your biggest. 8,000 people is impressive. Any label's going to be want to see.
Yeah, I mean, we had the same production company that were running the Spice Girls tour at the time. I remember I had 120 people working for me that day to pull that show off, and it worked, and it was incredible. And DC Talk, it was the Jesus Freak album. It toured it in America, so it was just a great show, and they were at the top of the game. Toby McKeon preached that night amazingly. My son, it was his very first show. He would have been about 6 months old. He was under the cabinet, the speaker cabinet, when Toby somersaulted off into the audience. So that's his claim to fame. Because of that, then people began to want to work with us. And I remember being flown to GMA to meet with labels and artists of people who might want to come and try to work that out. But the significant meeting was a meeting I had with David Smallbone. And David told me a bit of his story about how he'd come from Australia to America, how he was in it for the ministry, wasn't interested in show business, wanted to serve the church. And I'll be honest with you, I'd had a lot of meetings like that. Nobody told me they were in it for the money. Everybody was in it for the ministry. He said, I want to bring Rebecca to the UK and we want to play Spring Harvest. And I knew that little festival. And I said, there's a few thousand people there across Easter. You maybe get 1,000 people at a late night concert. It's on the fringe. It's not important to the festival, really. They just put it on as late night entertainment. They'll pay you £300 a show, and we could probably do 3 shows. So I said, if you brought Rebecca and you came over and you brought backing tracks, we'd probably get the label to pay for the airfares and we can make it work. And he said, no, it's Easter. I'm bringing my whole family, me and my wife and my 7 kids. He said, I'm bringing my band. It's a full band, and we're bringing the PA guy. We're going to do the whole thing. There's going to be 16 of us on the road minimum. I said, look, they're not going to pay for that. We could get, the label will put more money in because you're going to invest, but you're going to have to invest a lot of money into that. And he said, no, I'm going to do it. I'll be honest with you, Ainsley, I left that meeting thinking, I'm literally never going to hear from that guy again. Why would he? I mean, it didn't make any sense. True to his word, they came. They did the 3 shows. They traveled in a little bus, not a sleeper bus, I mean a bus with seats in it, between 2 venues, 3 nights. And it was a killer schedule. And they walked away with £900. And I reckon it cost 20 grand. But what happened is I had lunch with David during that trip. And he asked me, if we do this in Europe, what's the best way to do it? And I rather boldly said, well, don't use an American booking agent at this point. They don't know Europe. Nobody's touring in Europe. I can help you with that. And I know the church. And he shook hands with me that day on that deal. And that deal still exists today. Anytime David wants to enact it, I work with him for decades. Never a cross word, never an unpaid bill on either side. Great friends. Because she did that, every record label in Europe heard about it. And when I said we want to come to Europe, every record label in Europe wanted Rebecca to play in their territory. We offered reasonable prices for the gigs. People got on board. Nobody lost any money. And as a result of that first tour, we probably did a couple of tours a year in Europe for 15 years.
Tell me the cities you played or the locations, countries.
One particular tour was probably the biggest tour in Europe for a generation. At that point, we'd have done a couple of shows in the UK, maybe London, Cardiff, Glasgow, Belfast in the UK, and then we would have done Scandinavian shows, because Scandinavian shows, rich countries, and they don't have a lot of churches, but the churches that have are big churches, and they pay well, and that always made sense. If we could do that, it meant that we could take risks in other areas. We did shows in Moscow. We did the first Christian show in Romania once the Berlin Wall came down. And at that time, it was the second biggest show ever after Michael Jackson. We played in Estonia, and we played in Hungary and Bulgaria, Milan in Italy, Paris in France, Germany, the Netherlands. Super popular shows in the Netherlands. Netherlands is a tiny country. We would do 3 shows in 3 days, and we would have like 2,000 to 3,000 people at every show. pretty much everywhere in Europe at some point. But basically, it would work like if somebody got in contact with me. There was a little thing on Rebecca's site that says, if you're in Europe and would like to organise a concert, speak to Gary Smith, and my contact details are on there. And I would always work on the basis of trying to work out, can we make this work? How can I make this work? What I would do is I would reach out to anybody who contacted us and say, have you done a show before? And if they said yes, great, they knew exactly what I was talking about. If they said no, it didn't disqualify them. It just meant that I would have to help them understand what it is that they were going to be dealing with, what it might likely cost, why the rider was important, and why we needed certain PA and certain lights and certain instruments and all that good stuff. But I talked to them like we were in ministry together, not like we were doing business. And that was important to me because that's what I was doing it for. For me, it was ministry. And so there's a whole bunch of festivals, some of them which still happening in Europe today. The first ever show they did were with Rebecca St. James. We specialized in going to places that people didn't go before. And we pitched it that people didn't lose money. For us, the win was, did the audience meet with Jesus? Did the artists have a good time? Did the promoter cover their costs? If any of those things broke down, for me, that was a fail. The great thing was, when I was working with David, most of the time we'd be on tour, he'd be on the road, and he would say to me, Gaza, do you think these guys have lost money tonight? And on a couple of occasions, I would say, looking at the numbers, Dave, I think they probably have. And he would say, go find out what the deal is. And then I would find out. And between us, we would then either go to the merch counter and take all the money off the merch counter, or I would send an email to my office and say, let's send these people some money back. So nobody lost money doing a Rebecca St. James day. That was our golden rule. Those things become known as well. And so people, they want to work with you. Great testimony to Dave and Rebecca, how they ran that part of the ministry, that they looked after people.
You know, I was a concert promoter for David in Australia.
Wow, I didn't know that.
You know, his experience and his exit from Australia has given him great empathy and compassion.
Yes.
I think very few people who run tours come with that perspective. Those hard knocks in life have made David a better person for sure.
Yeah, I'm sure they have. And to be honest, the way that everything was set up, and one of the reasons I think I fit well into that touring family really was, we just wanted to make sure everybody had a good time. So we wanted to make sure the promoter had a good time. So we would always have dinner with a promoter. They would always be invited into devotion. It wasn't we just drop into their city. We wanted to be part of it. One of my things I learned to do very quickly was, on the rider, I would say, one of the things when it talk about food, and, you know, it's weird. Sometimes people have got all sorts of intolerances and things that you've got to put in the rider. But I would always put, we would be very interested in trying any local delicacies.
Oh, wow.
And what I realized about that was, number one, we have some really interesting food. Number two, they would say, once they saw that, our local dish is this. We need to make sure we give them the very best version of this local dish. A great cook, or the woman in the church that made this better than anybody else, or they would have it sent in from a local restaurant. And we had fantastic food and fantastic experiences. Everybody always wanted to work with us again. So it was a great thing, really.
You told me earlier about that priest in Austria.
Let me tell you a typical story. I get an email from a parish priest from a village in the Tyrolean mountains of Austria, who said, is there any chance that Rebecca St. James would do a tour date with us? And I know that we're going to be in Germany, we're going to be in Switzerland, so we could probably make it work, you know. So again, have you ever done a show before? No. Okay. Well, look, this is what it's going to involve. We'd need to be able to achieve like a minimum fee of this, which is going to help pay for our, you know, expenses. And also, this is the production that we're going to need, the PA and the lights and the back line. If you can achieve that, then I'm sure that we could work something out. And didn't hear anything for a month. And then I get an email back where he says, it's on. And I'm like, oh, I didn't realize I'd committed to it, but okay. So fit into the schedule. And we're on a tour bus, actually, and we've done a big show in Switzerland the night before with, thousands there. It was like a kind of one-day festival thing. And next morning, there's a knock on the door, and I'd go to the door, and I recognize what I guess was the parish priest, because he's got his dog collar on, and he says, "What time are you getting up?" And I said, "Oh, it'll be a while. We had a late night last night. We've traveled through." And he said, "Oh, only I've got a choir, and the mayor's here for your greeting ceremony." So I'm like, "Oh my word!" So I've got to get everybody up, somewhat make myself unpopular by getting everybody up and say, we get there, and as Rebecca comes off, there's this children's choir and a greeting from the local mayor. As all this is going on, the parish priest comes up to me and he said, "I don't think I've done a great job of the promotion." I said, what do you mean? How many people are coming? And thinking, oh my word, there's going to be like 50 people here or something. And he said, "We've only sold 900 tickets. And I say, "How many people live here?" He said, 1,300. I said, "How many people from outside the village have bought a ticket?" And he said, "About 15. So I said, "My friend, relatively speaking, this is the most successful Christian concert of all time."
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you imagine the sort of gig you would really like to do, if you're in music ministry and you're doing a gig and you haven't just got the kids from the local village, you've got their parents, you've got the mayor, you've got the chief of police, you've got the fire chief, you've got the local authority there. Everybody's there. And you're thinking, this is a life-changing moment. Most people in that village had never been to a concert. We had to tell them how to clap on the beat. It couldn't happen now because of the proliferation of social media and the internet. Everybody would know that stuff. But it was remarkable. And I think we probably went back to that village maybe 2 or 3 times again over the years. It's so impactful.
How's the language going? I mean, Austrians speak German, isn't it?
That was always this fascinating situation. Everywhere we went, part of my job would be to ahead of time say, as well as singing, Rebecca, she speaks quite a lot between songs. What's people's grasp of English? In most places, it worked much better if just Rebecca spoke on stage in English. Occasionally what would happen is they say, "We'll need to have a translator." Very quickly you would realize Rebecca would say something, and there'd be a reaction from the audience immediately. And then 2 minutes later, it's translated and it's lost a bit because people have already heard it. And also, stuff got lost in translation. There's weird stuff that happens sometimes. We had some great translators. You've got Rebecca, at the time, probably 21, 22-year-old young woman, sharing her heart about her love for Jesus and how she's saving herself until she gets married. And you've got like a 50-year-old guy translating for her. I'm like, this doesn't work. After a while, I would say, we don't need a translator. We don't need a translator, and wait for the pushback, strong pushback. And then I'd say, can you please find between a 20 and 25-year-old girl who's an expert in English, not who does English at school, but is like got a degree in English or has traveled extensively, and we'll meet with her and we'll spend a couple of hours with her before the show, and we'll make sure that we're good to go. So yeah, that's the way we did it, really. If you went to a place like the Faroe Isles, which we did, Faroe Isles is like kind of owned by Denmark, in between Scandinavia and Iceland and Greenland, that kind of just little group of islands, bizarrely incredibly Christian. Who even knew? I didn't. To be honest, amazing. I had to look on a map to find out where it was when the inquiry came in. But I quickly realized, having spoken to the people who were fantastic people, that once we announced the show, they knew what the audience was and it would sell out. The fee was okay, but what was it off the chart was merch sales and CD sales, because so many people would come to the concert and devour that stuff because they had no access to it directly. And the show was fantastic. But we had a unique situation that we never had before, which is the briefing before the show, where the promoter says, "It's going to be a great show tonight. Everybody's going to love it. But just to let you know, If a whale comes into the bay, everybody in the concert will leave and go into the bay to help to kill the whale. So what? Yeah, if they're in the water when the whale gets killed, they get a proportion of the whale to actually put in their fridge and their freezer to take home with them. But if they're not there, they don't get it. So just to let you know, that's what will happen. So that makes for a somewhat of an interesting prayer meeting when you praying the show's going to go well, the Holy Spirit's going to visit, and please God, could you stop the whale coming into the bay? But fortunately, it didn't come in, so that was good.
They're still allowed to kill whales, but I guess this was 20, 30 years ago.
But they still are. Without being too graphic about it, it's actually, they do it by hand. So everybody has like a blade, and they kill it by hand. So it's, yeah. I think there are 3 or 4 countries in the world that are still allowed to kill whales. Faroe Isles, been there. Norway, been there. They served us whale for dinner, which was an interesting experience. And Japan. I went to Japan with Rebecca as well.
Rebecca played a show in Japan?
Just as Rebecca was deciding that she wanted to come off the road, I think we'd done a tour of Europe. We'd kind of almost said goodbye to each other, in terms of our professional relationship. We were great friends because we worked together so much, to the point where the last few years David didn't even come on the tours. He knew me well enough, and Rebecca and the kids knew me well enough that I could look after them. The final tour of Europe, Rebecca's like, yeah, I'm just going to do a few more shows in America and then I'm finished. And a few weeks after that, I got a call for some dates in Japan, and I've never worked as hard, Ainsley, to get some shows, because I really wanted to go to Japan, and I couldn't think of any way that I'd ever be able to afford to go myself. So actually the shows were on an American airbase. We did, I think 3 shows in Japan on this airbase. I remember having been there for 3 days, ringing my kids, and my kids saying, Dad, what's Japan like? And I said, I have no idea, but I can tell you exactly what small town America's like. I'm living in a town with 11,000 Americans. And we had a day off. And I said to the people who'd organized the thing, so, well, we've got a day off. We really want to spend it well. What do you think we should do? And they said, we've organized to take you to Disneyland. I'm like, hey, I don't think we want to do that. And they're like, really? And I said, yeah. I said, Rebecca plays, Disneyland and Walt Disney World. We're in Japan. And they said, well, we work on the American airbase. We don't really know what do you want to do? And I said, we'll go to Tokyo Sky Tower, we'll visit a temple, and we'll go downtown in Tokyo. And it was like, suddenly I'm the road manager, know more about Japan than the people who have actually lived there for 5 years. So we do all that. And then they said, we've organized dinner for you. And I said, where is it? And they said, TGI Fridays. And I said, hey, listen, that's really kind of you, but would you mind cancelling the booking? We're going to find a Japanese restaurant. We're going to try some Japanese food. So fascinating times. Let me just tell you an interesting thing coming out of that Japan story. So stopped in Amsterdam to change planes. The keyboard player with Rebecca stayed in Amsterdam, flew home for the night to be with my wife. Then I flew back to Amsterdam the next day, and then got a flight to Norway and met with Joel and Luke, who were putting this band together called For King and Country, to do their first international dates. So there was literally 1 day crossover in my life between working with Rebecca and working with For King and Country.
What's that keyboard player, David Duss?
I'll tell you a funny story about David Duss in a minute. No, it's actually a guy called Fred Williams.
Oh, Fred.
Yeah.
Player.
He knew Japan really well because he'd been there with the Backstreet Boys. David Duss, I'm still in contact with. We were out on tour, actually. And I said to him, as a joke, I don't think that keyboard thing that you're doing is very hard. I suspect a lot of it's just on that computer that you've got above the keyboard, isn't it? And he said, oh, not as much as you think. And I said, well, there's a bit, and he said, actually, to be fair, Gary, there is one track where I actually don't play anything. It's all on the computer. I was like, okay. So the next night we were in Denmark. There's about 2,500 people there. And my job is, there's a bit in the show where Rebecca and three of the guys sit on stools as they do a song. And I'm stage managing that night. And so I take the stools on. And as I walked past the keyboard riser, I said to him, I'll take it from here then, because I knew it was a track that he didn't have to play on. So he jumped off stage and I actually played keyboards in front of 2,500 people.
Fantastic. You stood behind that keyboard like a pro.
Exactly. And it was entirely for my own entertainment and to shock Rebecca St. James, which worked beautifully on both counts.
That's fantastic. What other tours did you do? I know you mentioned the Newsboys.
Because of this showcase, but also because of the reputation that we developed, putting tours together, which hadn't happened for years in the UK, probably not since like Larry Norman, Andre Crouch days, you know. So we kind of put a network of shows together, a circuit of shows and promoters. We had incoming lines from that point, you know, of artists that wanted to work with us. So we did a whole bunch of stuff with Newsboys. I did shows with Michael W. Smith, DC Talk. I also did some like Ernie Hassan Signature Sound, pretty much everybody on the Goatee label, because I'd worked with Toby with DC Talk. He was a co-owner or owner of Goatee. I did, I think, one show with a Goatee band, and then after that, everybody on their label came through at some point, including like Jennifer Knapp out of Eden and many others. We worked with Lunar Halo and we worked with All Star United and some bands that used to kind of have a little bit of a following. We could do like almost, you know, very simple shows. I'm trying to explain to people how we needed to make it work so people didn't lose money was part of the challenge. I never wanted anybody to lose money on any of these tours, you know. And so that meant some tours didn't out just because we could never get the numbers together. And I was okay with that. In fact, I turned down some big dates because I just thought, you know what, if this went wrong, my ministry couldn't stand this. And that's okay. We always felt like we were invested in God's economy anyway. So they all worked out in the end. I guess the other big, because I know they've just announced a reunion tour, the other band that we worked with loads was Third Day, my co-partner in ministry. Because of the work we did with Newsboys early days, he ended up doing a little bit of tour pastoring for Newsboys on a tour where Third Day were the support act. They really liked him. And then for probably 10, 15 years, he was out with them 2 weeks out of 4 for 15 years. So any work that Third Day did in Europe, we kind of looked after them as well.
Europe sounds like a great tourist destination, a great place to tour. Do you think it can be done? And would you say at an economic level, don't plan to come and make a lot of money?
The biggest challenge for me was getting people to be honest with themselves about what their motivation was. I felt like I could work with anything if you told me why you were coming. If you were in a band, Ainsley, and you said, you know what, I'd love to play a show because I want to take my wife on holiday in Rome. So I'd like to do 2 shows on the way that pay for the flights. That's not the best motivation for ministry for me, but at least I understand it, okay? So I can then make a decision about whether I can make that work. You might say, well, do you know what? I think if we do this well, we can make a lot of money in Europe. And I never had any problem working with any of the big booking agents in Nashville because I never was under any illusions that they were in it for the ministry. I just understood it was a business. Could be country music, could be rock music, could be Christian music. It doesn't make any difference. I can work with that because I understand it. Now, it's not my motivation. And it's not going to justify why I want to work with them, but at least I knew what I was talking to. The biggest challenge was when people said, we'd love to come and do some mission work in Europe. And what they really meant was, because I want to take my wife on holiday or because I want to make a lot of money. In the main, unless there was a string of big festivals, and there weren't many of those, but occasionally that did happen, or there was some sort of mainstream interest, then it kind of didn't make any sense. So a band like Skillet would be able to come to Europe and make money because they weren't reliant on the church turning out to come to a gig. In fact, most people in the church in the UK don't even know what Skillet is, but they can play Download Festival with Ozzy Osbourne back in the day and, you know, get a good fee for that. So, and then maybe do a couple of Christian shows in Europe and it all makes sense sort of thing, you know. So It's always been ministry ultimately.
Did you ever do any dates with Skillet?
Yeah, I did. I've got a feeling I did a date with Skillet before Zach was the manager. In fact, it might even be before Smallbone was the manager.
Right.
And it was one of those where they'd got a real buzz, you know, and I'd listen to the music and I could see where it fit. And they were coming to Europe, and I did what I would have normally done on a situation like that. Was I would say, in the city I lived in, my youth ministry, I could have put you on, or I could have put a Christian label artist on, and would get the same number of people come, unless it was a big name. So I knew that 300 kids are going to turn out, whoever's on. So I would just cut my cloth accordingly. So if Skillet would come in, I would say, would you like to play in Cardiff? And if you would, I can pay you that amount of money. And if they said, we'd love to come, but we need twice as much as that, I'd say, thank you very much. Then it can't happen. The only way that that could happen is if I booked all their dates in Europe. I would risk my own fee on the promotion of a show in Cardiff that almost certainly would lose money. And I was fine with that. I was administering that. That's how it worked. But yeah, Skillet did come. And I think there was 300 people there, and probably about 150 of them thought they were great, and 150 of them thought they were a bit loud.
That's great. Yeah. Being in Perth in Western Australia, when I was doing promoting for David, there was a limit to how many bombs you could get on seats, so to speak. You know, you knew what that was, but we always made it work. I never really cared if I made the money or not. And I think you've spoken to that, and so has David. And I really respect the fact that he went out there and did that, even though it cost him a lot to start with, you know, with Rebecca. It's so impressive to me.
What I didn't realize until a number of years after I'd started working with Dave and Rebecca was I connected with a guy in Nashville who was a manager at the time, was managing a band at that time called Small Town Poets. And he wanted to do some dates in Europe, and we put those dates together. And he said to me, I'm not expecting to make any money. I heard these things all the time. And I was like, yeah, okay, cool. And he said to me, no, I used to be on Petra's management team. And he said, back in the day, we invested $30,000 in Europe. And that would have been a lot of money, early days of Petra. And he said, and they're still making money today in Europe. What Petra did is exactly what David did probably 10, 15 years later. And it still works. You've got to be bold. You've got to invest. And also recognize that you're never going to make as much money in Europe as you are in the States, in the Christian music industry, at least.
Do you feel like the receptivity to the gospel is up? Or like where's it gone in Europe?
I cannot even describe this to you. So I've been in ministry for 30 odd years now. I live in Wales, and Wales is known as a land of revival. Some of the great revivals across the world started in Wales. I've felt I've had a promise over my life for the last 30 years that I would see the greatest move of God that this nation has ever seen. And I get up every day believing that. In the last year, the research has been done, unquestioning the receptivity of the gospel is the greatest it's ever been in my lifetime. So I'm talking 60 plus years, since before the Second World War. And the greatest growth of people responding to the gospel are young people and young men. The whole time I've been in ministry, the church has been on the decline. And the greatest decline has been amongst young people, and the greatest decline in young people has been on young men. And it's exactly the opposite now. And it can only be God. We all playing our parts. We're all doing what we hope is impacting ministry that will connect people to the gospel. You know, that's what we're all about. But there's a move of God that's happening amongst young people that's front page of the newspapers in the UK, is covered on national TV at the moment as people are trying to get their head, why Gen Z? Just taking the spiritual aspect out of it for a minute. It's something to do with coming out of COVID. It's something to do with alienation. It's something to do with individualization. It's something to do with the fact that people have been given everything that they could be, that they were told that would give them hope, life, and purpose. And they felt hopeless and without any purpose, and have been drawn to the gospel and found that it works. I am so optimistic at the moment.
I had heard rumors of this, so this is a good thing.
It's going to be interesting to see whether it actually upticks into Christian music, or whether actually what we will see is what the things that all CCM artists really hope for, you know, the magical crossover, where we'll actually see artists who are Christians that are just doing what they do across in the mainstream, but Christians can connect to it. That is one thing I would say in the UK, almost without exception, there's been no Christian artist that ever has really crossed over.
What about U2?
There's a very, very good example. They're the exception, I would say. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. They are the bold exception for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. U2 were not a popular Christian band that crossed over into the mainstream. They were a band of Christians that were basically ploughing their furrow in the mainstream. People can tell you about the one Christian gig that they did. 10,000 people would have seen them when they played at the main stage at Greenbelt. I think I've met at least 35,000 people who tell me that they were there at that gig.
That's funny. That's funny. So they played Greenbelt. Wow.
Yeah, they did. Yeah. And actually years later, Bono turned up dressed as a steward because he wanted to see Bruce Cockburn.
What have you moved on to? I mean, and okay, first of all, you stopped doing that for the most part.
A little while after Rebecca stopped, not long after. We was much more involved in running a ministry in Wales, where I live. And then 10 years ago, I merged the organisation I work with a much bigger organisation. And I'm now part of their global leadership team called The Message. Some of your listeners will have remember the Worldwide Message Tribe from back in the day. That became this global organization called The Message. We've got our bands and we're involved in community transformation and training evangelists. And for a charity, it's a pretty significant charity in the UK and also increasingly in Europe and across the world. My connection with ministry really is that when Rebecca stopped touring, I said to Dave Smallbone, look, I'm probably going to stop now as well, but I'll always do anything you ever want me to do. And so if I've ever had a call for King and Country, either to go out as I did some road management with them, I've gone out as their tour pastor, I've dropped into the occasional date, both in America and in the UK, to actually do devotions for the band and crew. I love doing that.
What was this thing you just did in Brazil? Tell me about that.
Nobody who's listening to this knows me from a slice of bread. So I'm a 63-year-old unfit guy who decided that in order to raise money for the not-for-profit that I work for, that I should actually run 100 kilometers in Brazil between Curitiba and Rio de Janeiro. So I kind of hopped on with a bunch of mates of mine who were doing a cycle ride between those two places, about 1,000 kilometers. And I ran every day for 8 days, 12.5 kilometers to raise money. It was an incredible adventure, brilliant time. The running was absolutely horrible, but I did it. And between us, we raised probably about $280,000, something like that. Definitely worth doing it financially. One of the things that we did while I was there, just quick story, was we've got a work now in Rio. And so we went to visit some work that we're doing in a favela, which is completely controlled by a drugs cartel. Whilst we were there, the pastor of the local church was like, oh, pray for that guy. And we, okay, and you go and pray for this guy. And they say, oh, well done. He's the leader of the drugs cartel. And okay. And there was a moment where we went into this area and there were 6 guys with machine guns. And there was a guy counting money and another guy sorting drugs out. And they said, we need to pray for these guys. And so we said, oh, we're going to pray. And they put all the machine guns down and stopped counting money and stopped sorting the drugs out. And we prayed for them, trying really hard not to pray that God would bless their business, you understand, but actually would convict their hearts. And all through the prayer, by the way, they're all going, amen, amen, hallelujah, hallelujah, yes, Jesus. And you're thinking, okay.
God takes people where they're at, man.
Exactly.
Perfection. Oh my gosh. Actually, the Christian music guys who was my last episode.
Yeah.
They were talking about the Rich Mullins movie.
Right.
So there's Ragamuffin and then there's, after Ragamuffin finished, I watched a documentary that came on straight after about Rich Mullins' life. Worth a watch.
Okay.
Absolutely insightful stuff. He was a guy who struggled with a lot of struggles, which you'll see in the movie. You know, yeah. He was a drunk half the time. He wrote Awesome God when he was drunk.
Wow.
You know, pretty much. And chain smoker. wore bare feet, but I'll tell you some of the things he said. I mean, he was an antagonist. He would just poke the bear of hypocrisy.
Yes.
And lived with absolute reality. And so I feel like it's almost a must watch.
I remember first time I came to Nashville, they did this multi-artist event. The two artists that got the biggest reception, Rich Mullins and Charlie Peacock. It was speaking something about integrity and doing a different thing. And it's not to say that people weren't loving Amy Grant and Michael and all that. They were. But there was something significant when those two guys came and did their bit, the reception that they got. And I mean, I got to know Charlie pretty well. He's still a friend. Once I met him, I completely got it.
So you saw Rich Mullins play live?
He did like 2 tracks at the Ryman, I think, during the Sunday night worship service as part of GMA.
Well, Gary, I thank you so much for your time. A little window into Christian touring in Europe. As it was, I usually reach out my hand to a handshake. So,
God bless, friend.
You too, mate.
I hope you enjoyed that with Gary Smith. I'm really glad I got to chat with him. Of course, we got more guests coming, great guests. Make sure you subscribe. Until next time, make sure you put good things in your ear holes. Out.